Right, thanks everyone for taking time today for the workshop. I'm just going to spend a bit of time to give a bit context in terms of how to think about starting a tech startup when you don't have any kind of tech background. We're going to go through three main sections about how should you get familiar with technology itself, what you should think about when it comes to hiring people working in technology, and what you should be aiming for as a kind of end product for what you should aim for in terms of building a technology site. The talk itself is not going to be that long. I'm going to try to run through some of the basics here. At any point of time, if there's any kind of questions, please feel free to post it and I'll try to answer them towards the end of the Q&A sections. Yeah. So let me just move on to the first section itself. What we're going to look at a little bit is understanding about the basics about technology. There are a lot of terminologies here that you probably have come across, things like UX, UI, what's the tech stack, you're using different types of programming languages like Ruby, React. Many of these things are actually, it sounds complicated, but it's actually not that hard to learn. And oftentimes Google is your best friend. At any point of time, if you feel like you don't really know what's happening, just feel free to Google it. There are a bunch of different websites out there. They'll give you the basics layout about what you should expect. But just a quick overview to give everybody a bit of context is that typically when you're trying to build a product, it composed of two main things that you have to build. One is known as the front end, and the other part is known as the back end. The front end is basically every type of code that relates to things that you can see. And the back end is mostly all the things that happen behind the scenes. And this will be the algorithm behind it, how things work. It's a fancy way of saying that basically you just need a combination of front end, which is packaging, and back end, which is the content itself to make the website work. I won't bore everybody a little bit with all the details when it comes to understanding the basics of technology. I guess if anyone have any interest, there are lots of great courses online. You can find it on Coursera, you can find it on SkillsFuture. You can just find it on Google as well. Actually, Google and most of the other tech companies have pretty good crash course if you want to be familiar about the basics of computing. But I guess the gist of the question for majority of people here today will be that if you're looking to build a tech startup, but you're not a technical person, what should you do, right? So maybe we're going to spend a bit more time in this section here that talks about what should you do when it comes to trying to build a tech startup. If you're a technical person, the logical thing to do here would be to try to do it yourself. That's definitely the best when it comes to cost and speed. Maybe one way, taking a couple steps back, is to understand a little bit from like the popular way of thinking about any kind of project is that you basically have three choices here: speed, cost, and quality. And at any point of time, you can basically choose two. For majority of tech startups, if you don't have funding yet, you don't really have a lot of options. If you can do the technical bit yourself because you have time to work on it, then DIY is a good option. If you don't have time to learn the skills, finding a freelance or asking your friends to help out is the best way to do it. If you have a little bit of funding, a much easier way to do it is for you to focus on the business side of things and then to outsource your product development to someone else who would be able to do it full-time for you. It's quite rare to be able to find a single engineer who can build your full product for you, but it's quite common to actually find an agency that has a ready team. They'll be able to complement from a UX perspective, building the front-end part of it, walking you through how the design experience should be like, and eventually building the back-end algorithms to kind of host the whole application. Yeah. I think the third part that I'm supposed to cover a little bit on would be the idea of what would matter in the tech startup. Oftentimes, a lot of people who are new to tech products, at least when you think about building an early startup product, you shouldn't be too worried about whether the product is scalable, whether it has the infrastructure to support 1 million users, or whether the user experience is going to be amazing. What you should really care about is that the technology product actually solves a real problem. And if you look at historically, a lot of some of the most popular tech companies out there, from Twitter to Facebook, in the very early days itself, they're quite famous for actually crashing. And that's actually one of the best signs to know that you have a product that actually works and people want it. So if you were to think about what you should be aiming for if you're building a tech product, a good thing to aim for is actually to aim for the idea of having so many users using it such that your product fails. And if your product fails because of this reason, it's actually quite easy to fix and to scale it up. So don't worry too much about trying to figure out if there's going to be any kind of technical debt. Like, are you building it right? Are you building it in a way that's scalable? Are you building it in a way that you can move fast in the future? What matters a lot is just building something good enough that solves the problem, proves the point, get customers, get so many customers that the product fails, and then you can think about improving the product subsequently. So that will be the perspective of what you should be possibly thinking about from an early startup product experience that you're aiming for. Yeah. I don't have a lot more to share. I'm just going to go to the last section itself, which is probably one way to think about it is that you don't really have to be a technical founder in order to do a tech startup. In fact, majority of the people here, some of them you might recognize, like Steve Jobs of Jack Ma, or even Brian Chesky from Airbnb. They're not technical founders by training. A lot of them are just really good at understanding the customer. And if they understand the customer, they figure out what the problem is. And companies are basically built to solve problems. Technologies are just there to scale the solution. So a tech startup is fundamentally a scalable way of trying to solve a problem. So don't be put off by the fact that you don't have the technical ability to get started in a tech startup. All you really need to do is really understand the problem and find a way to solve it. Implementing the technology is probably the easiest part of the whole puzzle. Yeah. So these are basically the three parts that I just want to share with everybody as a quick overview. But maybe I'll take a little bit of time to share my personal experience when it comes to going through this tech journey. So I started building startups, tech startups, probably 10, 11 years back. Back then, my training was actually in mechanical engineering. So I didn't know how to write any line of code at all. And when I got started building the first product, I actually had to ask my friends who were coders to help me out. So I didn't write a single line of code, but I understood what the problem was. And I worked with my friends who understood how to write code. And together we built the first initial product. Now, over time, by working with people who understand code, that's when I had an opportunity to pick up certain knowledge. I understand how to talk to them. I understand what were the jargons they were using. How were they thinking about infrastructure? What were the problems? What were common things? And many of the times, whatever I don't understand, all I needed to do was just Google around, spend a bit of time, read up on it, and you get a good grounding. Now, somewhere in probably around 1 or 2 years of just trying to figure out my way through the product conversations, I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of solve a problem, which is just, let's sit down, take a month, let's learn how to code properly. Let's learn the basics of coding. I took an online course. It wasn't really that hard. And by the end of it, I realized that I'm not a good coder. But the experience of going through it to understand the point of view of what a coder goes through, it gives you a perspective of, okay, this is what is doable. And that's probably the most important thing for majority of early stage tech founders to be, is to understand what are the limits of technology and how you can implement it to build a product that solves the problem. The actual implementation of the technology, writing the code and such, those things are quite easy in terms of finding the right people to do the job. And majority of the times today, it's quite easy to find people who have prior experiences before. Most tech startups aren't usually that unique. If you're doing something with blockchain, you can find someone who have done something in blockchain before. If you're trying to build a version of Uber for X, there'll be someone who has done something that's Uber for X before. And working with these people who have prior experiences is probably the best way to build a good technical team that will have a good runway in terms of scaling up a startup in the long term. So if all of you here have a perspective, which is I'm not a technical person, how would my journey in terms of being a founder in a tech startup would look like? Well, most likely what you do is that you try to find people who have a little bit of ability to work with you to build an early version of a prototype. Through that journey, you understand a little bit more about technology because you have to force yourself to learn about it. You force yourself to learn by reading up on Google. You force yourself to learn by attending some courses online. That will give you the context in terms of thinking about how to build products and what are the limits of it. It's a process that never ends. You're always going to be learning new things. But to really scale your technology through the future, you probably want to look for someone with more of a technical background. And the best way to think about it is that find someone who has already been doing what you need done, but have been doing it for X number of years, right? Nothing really beats experience in terms of investments of time to build it up. It's rarely a good idea for startups to rely on a very junior team when it comes to building technology products. Oftentimes what will happen is that you're building something that is not good enough. And part of the reason is because if you have never done it before and you're doing it for the first time, most often you would actually build something a little bit subpar. But if you're working with someone who has built something quite similar before, it takes them a fraction of the time to actually build something that is quite close to completion. Yeah. So that would be a great way to think about it. So end of the day, I guess one thing you should always keep in mind is to look at the probably like a time horizon in terms of when you have the idea and when you imagine yourself launching this tech startup. If you want to launch a tech startup within a few months, it's quite unlikely for you to actually learn how to code and develop it on your own. It's way more likely for you to work with a partner who understands it and can complement your journey. But if you're thinking about, I probably want to do a tech startup in about 2-3 years down the road, then it's probably a good idea to invest consistently some amount of time to understand how to code, to understand a little bit about product management, to understand a little bit about design thinking. All these things will actually come to fruition within the next few years. But you need to figure out probably the number one question, which is how much time do you have before you're actually thinking about launching this tech startup? That'll be the number one factor in terms of figuring out what are your options between a freelance, a full-time, or doing it yourself. Yeah. Okay. I guess that's all about it from me on my side. Is there any questions that anybody would like to ask? It's probably the last session of the day. I guess everyone's a little bit tired. So maybe I could answer one question that's always come out whenever we have conversations with new startups. One of the key questions they always ask would be, how much does it cost to actually build an early stage MVP product? That's a pretty good question to ask, but it really depends on most outsourced vendors that you're going to talk to or partners you're going to work with are going to ask you like, how much money do you have? But one way of thinking about it would be, let's say an early stage seed company would typically get about $20,000 to $50,000 investment to kind of build a very early rough MVP prototype. And the assumption here will be a majority of it will be spent into building a product. And you probably want to build this product within 3 to 6 months window. So a good range to think about it will be somewhere between $20,000 to $50,000 will be probably the first investments you're looking at into building an early product. I saw a question here. Let me see if I can find it again. Oops. Anyone else have any questions? So we're asking, how can I help someone to commercialize software is created? Generic advice on moving forward. Well, commercializing a software, maybe one way to think about it is that typically for any kind of softwares with customers, it's either in one or two industries where you're trying to do enterprise sales, which is B2B, or you're trying to do B2C, which is direct to consumer. Enterprise sales are usually not that easy for early stage startups to get in. especially if your clienteles are the bigger partners like banks or government agencies. Part of the reason is because early stage startup won't have enough funding and enough technical know-how to kind of build up the required security protocols to pass some of the internal barriers when it comes to selling to enterprise. So if you have a commercial software and you're thinking to get into enterprise space in the long run, it's a good to probably find a bit of a visionary within one of those tech companies that are buying from you. Try to get them to be an early adopter, an ambassador within an organization who's going to try to find a loophole for you to kind of figure out how you can implement it without having to comply with all the security protocols required. So complying with security protocols is probably one of the biggest hurdles when it comes to an early stage startup trying to get into enterprise business. Yeah. Is there any other questions? So one of the common things that when we talk to probably people who are aspiring to become entrepreneurs in the future and they imagine themselves to be tech founders in the future would be to ask, like, on the track in terms of technical abilities, there are generally three things that you can specialize in. One would be probably in the design angle, where you're trying to get good at building UI and UX. Which is basically you're trying to be someone who's really good at designing the customer experience for the product. Another track that you can think about is probably what we call like the typical software engineer route, where you be the guy who's a little bit geeky, you understand logics, you're good at math, you build a backend system, and you basically build a code behind the system. But the third piece, which a lot of people will probably be more suitable for, like if you are a founder today and you're not a tech background founder, the easiest way to get into it will be, because you tend to understand, I would say, like the business needs. The easiest track that you can get into is something we call product management. So product managers, there are a bunch of good courses out there, but the fundamental kind of purpose of a product manager is to know what product to build. So you need to understand what the problem of the customer is. You need to understand what are the constraints you can solve. You need to understand the operations of how people are going to be involved in this whole process. And then you need to be able to imagine a solution. With the imagination of the solution, you come out with a scope of work. This scope of work will be improved by the UX designer to build a good experience. It will be used by the engineer to build the product infrastructure and algorithms and all the codes behind the scene. But for the early stage founder in a small company and you're trying to get into a tech product space, the most valuable skill to have is to know what product to build. And the best out is actually to go along the track, which is to be a product manager. Yeah. Cool. Right. Is there any other questions that anybody has? So one of the things is that if you really want to build any kind of application that is accessible over the internet, the likelihood of you being able to protect your idea through intellectual property, it's quite unlikely for a tech startup early on. As long as anyone can see how it works, it's quite easy to replicate it. They don't need to have your exact code base. They just need to know if you click this button, then this happens. If I see here, then this table shows up. Those kind of logics are quite easy to reverse engineer. So in theory, you shouldn't be too obsessed about the idea of trying to protect intellectual property. It's quite rare for a non-technical founder to build a product that has a very strong IP protection, because majority of the things that you can imagine is actually you can imagine a better way of solving the existing problem, which there is some form of solution already out there, but you have a hack or you have an engineer's method of making it better. So oftentimes intellectual property when it comes to your software itself isn't that relevant. You can protect it when you're big, The companies like Facebook and Google, they invest a lot of money in terms of trying to get anything that is any bit novel written by their engineers being seen through by their lawyers, and they'll try to go through intellectual properties to file it. But a lot of these are just mostly defensive moves. Unless you have a lot of money, just like these big tech giants, you wouldn't be in any position at all to sue someone who's copycat. Your best bet here is actually to out execute people. So early stage startups shouldn't be too worried about protecting intellectual property. You should be more obsessed about executing better than your competition. Most of the time, you'll be copying from them and they'll be copying from you, and everybody will be learning from each other. The one that performs the best, that integrates the fastest, that executes the best, will be the one that eventually wins. It's rarely the one that will have an intellectual property that prevents anyone from doing the same thing. Because in theory, you won't have enough money to actually go ahead and pursue a law case over anybody. Yeah. So obsess about execution. I wouldn't obsess too much about intellectual property for early on. Cool. Any other questions? So maybe one thing that will be quite interesting, and this is quite a common experience if you talk to a lot of people who don't have a technical background and they try to get into the tech product. It's very common to hear stories where the first time when they try to work with someone else, they got burnt. They basically work with people who promise them the moon and never deliver on the product. And part of the reason here is, I guess, if you're trying to find a deal that is too good to be true, it's probably not true. It's really hard to find someone who you can get to build you a very complicated product for very minimal amount of money, and somehow it will magically work. That is pretty uncommon. What would matter a lot if you're an early stage startup and you don't have a lot of technical abilities, or you don't have a lot of money to hire a good team, is you really want to obsess about what is known as the minimum viable product. Focus on what is the minimum set of things that you need to build in order to validate that there is a product approach to solving the problem. So do as little as you can. Forget about the bells and whistles. Forget about making it looking too pretty, or making it very sophisticated, or making the user experience very amazing. Just focus more on the functional perspective of things. Does it really solve the problem better than existing solution? If you have a way of doing that, and you figure out the minimum amount of things that you need to do in order to achieve that goal, then you can invest whatever money or whatever time you have to focus on the minimal viable product that will give you the best chance of actually building a decent product in your first try. Okay. Subsequently, if you have proven out that you can build a product that actually solves a real problem, it is not uncommon to actually go to a platform like Funded Here, or through VCs, or to your school network, or your friends and family, and raise the second actual round of money. And that's when you actually kind of convert an idea into a real company. Yeah. Anything else? Anyone want to ask? So probably another good point that majority of people will be thinking about, that if you are not a tech founder and you're hiring a third party to build a technology, what does it mean after the technology has been built? Do you then go on and pay a monthly maintenance to keep the product alive? This is quite a common question, and oftentimes it's a perspective that if you're an early stage business founder and you're building a tech startup, you need to have a slightly different point of view. If you're building a tech startup, the investment into technology never ends. It's not really like you're paying a certain fixed amount of money and then at some point you don't have to pay it anymore. Whenever your product has been built and whenever your product is being used by real people, it will always have problems. It will always have ways you can improve it. So if you're thinking about investing and building into a tech product, what you should really keep in mind is less about, okay, If I have $50,000, what I want to do is just spend $50,000 one shot, get a product, it's perfect, and I don't have to do anything anymore. That never works out. What you should think about instead is that if I have $50,000 and okay, I imagine it probably takes me about 6 months so that I have enough time to sell to enough people and make enough money. And with the new money, I can invest into keeping this business alive. So I need a product that will actually have continuous development over a 6 months period minimum. Then you want to stretch your money as long as you can. So think a lot more from a perspective of if you're raising money, don't think about raising X dollars to build X product, but think about raising X dollars in order to have a runway to continuously improve your product, build new features, respond to bugs and problems on your product for X period of months. The X period of months is very much dependent on how long it takes you to actually find a product market fit, where you can actually reach a point where your product can actually be sold to real customers, and real customers are actually paying you real money. With the real money, you can continue reinvesting and keep your company alive. So it's more about a perspective shift. Don't think of it as buying a one-time purchase, but think of it as a monthly. You basically have to think of it from monthly from day one. Okay, so this is a great question here about who you should hire. Should you hire people who are like-minded, probably the same age, or should you hire someone with a bit more experience, a bit older, probably a little bit different? There are few kind of contradictory kind of suggestions in this space, but I guess the more popular one would be the fact that if you're hiring people to join your team early on, whether it's for a tech role, any role at all, the number one success factors for startup is usually culture fit. Find people that you enjoy working with, because building a startup is a very painful journey, right? So Elon Musk has a popular phrase that says like, building a startup is looking into the abyss and chewing glass. It's not a fun thing to do. And oftentimes people would joke that whoever you found a company with, it's almost as if you're married to that individual. So find people that you can actually enjoy being around. It's going to be a long journey if it's a successful journey. And if you want to be successful, you have to be there for the long run. So find someone who matches your personality, have the same work ethic, and something you want to do. So this is a great question here. So if you want to build a B2B software that is AI focused, how do you get your customers, clients, or partners to actually be open to sharing data with you? It's quite a sensitive question to ask today. Majority of companies will not be open to sharing data with you unless you have proven before that it works. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. I wouldn't share data with you unless you can show me that your solution works. But it's very hard to show that your solution works without actually training it on their data. And this is a chicken and egg problem that exists with majority of AI companies. And even if you get the data from your clients or partners, one of the kind of unknown costs is really how structured is the data, how good is the data, how much time you have to spend to clean the data and format it to actually be usable. It's a tough job, right? So I don't think most early stage startup will actually be able to just go to a client or partner and get them to say, hey, give me your data. The best way you can think about it, if you are young and you're still in school, is actually to take the angle, which is more of an academic approach, right? Most companies, even big companies, are a little bit less reserved if they imagine that their data is being used as part of a research project, if it's being used as part of an academic research project. So if you're starting a new startup in a space that's AI related, and very likely you're learning AI or machine learning or computer science from someone in your university, it's a good idea to partner up with your professor and approach those companies together with your professor and have the data sharing be with your professor in terms of a research project. And then the model that gets trained up from this research project, you can commercialize it together with your professor, and they'll be part of the asset of your new company. But probably the best way to approach it is really to go to them and say, hey, it's part of a research project. I know you don't trust me as an early stage startup, but you can trust this school, you can trust this academic research, you can trust this openness of this whole academic process. And as a result, they'll be more willing to share the data with you. Cool. Any other questions? So this could be probably something that most tech startups will come across at some point. And this would be an idea of, I built a tech product that kind of works early on. I've spent some money on it. I have some customers using it, but I need to grow my company right now. Should I actually spend more money on building my product, or should I be spending more money on other parts of building my company? In the technical world, we tend to call this technical debt. Most products are kind of patchy early on. You basically have lots of band-aids. You add a lot of bells and whistles and features that were probably not originally planned to be there, and eventually it becomes a bit of a hack job. It's a Frankenstein monster, and most engineers would have this aversion to keep working on a Frankenstein monster because it doesn't look beautiful. So there would always be the pushback, which is like, it's about time for us to kind of upgrade the system. Let's do something about it. Let's improve technical debt. But how worthwhile is it to invest in it? Maybe a kind of a ballpark figure is to kind of understand, when was the product built? Logically, any big product would have a major revamp maybe every 2 to 3 years. That is quite common, to actually upgrade a lot of the backend infrastructure and technology stack. Part of the reason is because the software world is always inventing something new. If you look at it historically, let's say 10 years ago, and you were building a new product, there were many things that you would have to do yourself. You would have to do security on your own. You would have to do search on your own. You would have to do maybe recommendation engine on your own. But if you're doing a startup today, you don't have to do any of these things. In fact, most of the time, there's a free third-party software that you can use, or there's a third-party SaaS tools that you can connect to and pay a few dollars every month and have like an Amazon level quality product. So things are constantly shifting in the direction where a lot of the product solutions are being modularized. And once they get modularized, they're actually part of a third-party tool that you can actually just pay a small fee and have access to world-class qualities. So every few years, typically when you're upgrading it, you're really trying to rethink again, okay, what is it that I really, really have to do on my own? And what is it that I can replace with something that's world-class out there but costs a fraction of the price? And this will actually reduce your overall maintenance costs, and it will actually improve your overall quality of experience. But this is a process that you actually need to go through every few years. Think about it, within 2 to 3 years, you normally have to do a major revamp. Usually every 6 months or so, you have a product roadmap that is brand new, kind of figure out what it's going to work on for the next 6 to 12 months. Cool. All right. Do we have anything else that we want to go through today? I guess one good question that always comes up when we talk to young people who are interested in entrepreneurship would be the idea of, if I want to launch a tech startup, should I launch it straight out of school? Or should I get a couple of years work experience first before actually getting into my own startup? There's no perfect answer to this, but one way of thinking about it is that running a startup, it's a low probability success event, which means that it's very unlikely for a person doing a startup to actually be successful. But the more times you play this game, and the more times you fail in this game, the higher your likelihood it is to be successful the next round. So if you're playing this game straight out of school on your own, very likely your first round of failure is going to be 100% on you. But if you are learning this by actually working for someone else, they actually pay a tuition fee. So that's not a bad idea. Yeah. Cool. All right. Probably let's ask the last round of questions if anyone have any. Cool. All right. Everyone's good. So maybe we can just end this here today. Yeah, give everybody an early break. All right. Thanks a lot for your time. See you all next time. Bye.